Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. To those of you watching this around the world, I wish to thank you for joining me on this tragically historic 93rd anniversary of the death of Frederick Charles Loveday, more commonly known as Saint Raoul, the first Thelemic saint whose untimely death in Cefalù marked the beginning of the end of Aleister Crowley's unique adventures within the Abbey of Thelema. When soaking oneself in cognac, opium and cocaine, one very quickly runs out of money. Now, what is not commonly known is that by this time the Abbey had also doubled up as a brothel of sorts, as a way of charging various locals a fee to help finance their unique lifestyles and also gain additional participants in the tantric practices from which they accrued sexual energies towards gaining enlightenment and expanding their consciousness onto the cosmic plane by transmuting these energies against opposing principles such as animal and human sacrifice. Now, advertisements were also placed in the British press as a way of trying to encourage paying disciples to travel over and join the Abbey in Sicily, which is where Frederick first got in touch with Aleister. And from the start, Aleister saw this boy as a prodigy, a potential magical heir. Now, what with the nature of the Abbey, he was encouraged to find himself a Scarlet Woman, or befriend a prostitute. Thus, the marriage to the prostitute Betty May, and Betty and Frederick both together travelled over to Sicily to join in the adventures within the Abbey of Thelema, to be mentored by his hero, the master magician, the master Therion, Aleister Crowley. You know, it was a tragic thing that happened. The boy was there for such a brief time, and only a few months in, they performed a magical ritual where they sacrificed a cat, and they both drank the blood and got infected, and both became terribly ill. Now, in all honesty, Raoul should have went to hospital. He should have went to hospital, but as he was new to the magical and alchemical training, the first stage in his alchemical training was calcination, the destruction of the ego. Thus, Raoul was issued with a razor blade, and every time he uttered the word I, he was to cut himself with this razor blade. And this boy could not help but not say I. Thus he was covered in lacerations, near head to toe in lacerations, and a gut full of infected cat blood. Now, if that boy had went to hospital, it was indeed the end of the Abbey of Thelema, beyond any shadow of a doubt. Aleister willed and hoped, and he was terribly ill as well, and they hoped and prayed that they would both pull through. But tragically, Raoul, on the 16th of February 1923, finally succumbed to the infection that he caught from the infected cat blood that they drank during the magical ritual on this unique and twisted adventure of a lifestyle that he consented to. And you know, as tragic as it was, he was the happiest he ever been. He wrote home, he was the happiest he'd ever been at the Abbey. And I mean, it still doesn't make the tragedy of his loss any easier, and ultimately it did spell the end of the Abbey of Thelema anyway. In the end, Mussolini stepped in and deported them all from the country, and the Thelema clan disbanded, and they all had various drug addictions, and You know, the girls have been working as prostitutes, and it was just a tragic end to what was a unique and brave and twisted adventure of a lifestyle which was misunderstood at the time, years ahead of its time, decades ahead of its time, and began the beginning of the wilderness years for Aleister Crowley, as the British press pretty much launched the first tabloid onslaught and thus branded the wickedest man in the world. And Raoul's bitter widow, the vindictive prostitute Betty May, set out to crucify Crowley and destroy him, and at the same time promote her own book and use it to her own advantage. I mean, keep in mind, she'd only been married to this boy for 3 months. I'm not trying to justify the death of Frederick by any means, but for Betty May to use that tragedy to her own advantage is a heinous thing. And in all honesty, Aleister Crowley barely tried to defend himself. I mean, he covered his trails, he covered his tracks, and to try and avoid going to jail for culpable homicide, you know. Just as 2 heroin addicts who both shoot up heroin together and one overdoses, and the police are all over you. Who bought the drugs? Naturally, the dead man bought the drugs. You know, it's a sad reality of life, but ultimately, the tragedy, the guilt, and the reason that Aleister never really fully defended himself is that Raoul should have been sent to hospital regardless of the outcome. I mean, ultimately it was the Abbey of Thelema disbanded anyway, and perhaps that boy could have been saved. And what a tragedy. And thus Crowley himself, still terribly ill, performed the burial rites, and you know, they couldn't even afford a burial plot. They buried the boy just outside the borders of the town, and the Abbey of Thelema disbanded, and they all went their separate ways, and many of them were blighted for the rest of their lives. Aleister pretty much went into solitude, apart from his dealings with the OTO and his remarkable creation of the Thoth Tarot deck, which a 5-month project which turned into 5 years. But considering the man had got off to such a high start and done so much so young in his life, it only goes to show how much guilt and pain he truly carried regarding the death of that boy. Now, I have wrote a special piece, in all honesty, which I wrote 2 years ago, when I first read about the death of Saint Raoul. The emotions and the pain I felt inspired me to write this piece, and I've always intended to recite this piece to the world on this tragically historic occasion. I've entitled this piece Saint Raoul AIP, Alive in Peace. Raoul, Raoul, you were taken too soon, my friend. We never finished your training or mastered your alchemy. I fear you are lost. I hope I'm wrong, and that you show up the same as the rest of the Thelemic clan from 93 years ago. Whomever you are and wherever you may be, I hope you AIP. Raoul, the Saint of Thelemic. If you would now join with me in a moment's silence to the memory of Frederick Charles Loveday, Saint Raoul, the first Thelemic saint. Thank you. Now, thank you for watching. And you lot take care. And be good. Or be bad. But be something and be proud. If every man and every woman is a star, then let your star shine and light up the world around you. Let your heart and mind guide you towards your true path of destiny, fueled by the inertia of the quintessence and the love of those around you, whom in turn you animate in a perpetual cycle of love and respect. Thank you for watching. Take care, and remember now, love is law, love under will.